So cool to have an author on, and so cool to have a book that's about something I had a total misconception about. This is a book called Kidnapped at Sea. It recounts this little known story, although it is one that I think has got into the zeitgeist a bit, of David Henry White. He's a free black teenager from Delaware. He was abducted by the Confederate raider ship. I'll have more on that as we talk to Andrew Sillen, the author. He'll fill in a lot of the details, but he was taken, White was, this teenager, black teenager, taken from a merchant ship under the false pretense that he was an enslaved person, and then he was forced into servitude and had 600 days of servitude with these incredibly harsh conditions. Again, we'll talk to Andrew about those. And this book folds into this incredible story all of these themes of maritime warfare and racial injustice and the distortion of historical memory. I mean, that's the big thing, how this story was perverted in the history that was told. So without any further delay, although I do love delaying, how about it for Andrew Sillen, everyone? Yeah. Wow. What a story. And it's interesting because it is a story that I was familiar with, but I was familiar with it in the wrong way. I mean, I think I'd heard the perverted story, Andrew Sillen, the story that made it sound like this 12-year-old was rescued, you know?
Well, you're one of the few people who even heard the perverted story. I mean, most of us, and certainly for myself, I never knew anything at all about this individual, perverted or otherwise. And it was a really random kind of event that caused me to encounter him. I encountered the story of the Alabama, the ship that he was enslaved on, while I was living in Cape Town in the 1980s. And that was a really strange encounter in itself, because who knew that there was a Civil War Confederate vessel that had visited Cape Town? But I encountered that, and I got interested in the story. And as I researched the Alabama, I encountered David Henry White, and then I discovered that everything that was written about him by the officers in their memoirs was completely untrue, absolute lies. And so my journey has been a journey of discovery and a kind of forensic journey to discover the truth about this young man. And as you so beautifully introduced this, the truth is really quite shocking.
And David Henry White, this young guy who finds himself in this predicament, how did you put together all of the pieces that then form the narrative, the correct narrative as to what happened?
Well, I read the memoirs of the Alabama's officers with skepticism. And, you know, I think a lot of this kind of thing amounts to asking the right question in the first place. It's not so much that the research itself was so difficult to do, but the initial question that you ask is what's important. And very early on, I decided that what I read about White did not sound correct. It couldn't be. And so I asked the question, what was his story and how could I possibly find his story? And that set me off on my own research journey, in which I recovered scant information there was about him. And even though there wasn't all that much information, it was very important information because it critically showed that everything that was written about him was a lie.
And it makes sense in a way that those officers who kept the log as to what was going on, they were part of the whitewash, you know. But what happened in the history after this incident was part of a more aggressive whitewash.
Yeah, the book is actually about at least two things, as you pointed out. One is the story of David Henry White, but the other larger story is how his life was appropriated by the Confederate officers in their memoirs, which became part of what's been known as the lost cause, a reinvention of the Civil War's purpose and a narrative that really whitewashes, as you say, the cause of the war, and also articulated this trope, which we're all familiar with, certainly those who watched mid 20th century and early 20th century Hollywood movies are familiar with the trope of the happy slave contented in servitude, part of a family relationship with all sorts of affection between masters and slaves. And
Yeah,
this was, of course, a series of falsehoods. And the interesting thing about White's story is that it's so easy to dispel it and to disprove it. And it's also that one of the fellow who wrote about him was one of the architects of the lost cause itself.
Raphael Semmes, is that how he says his last name?
Yeah.
He was really one of the driving forces, if not the driving force that you note in the book, was associated with the recharacterizing this entire story as speaking sort of for a Confederate rescue, a way to whitewash essentially all the real facts of history.
Oh yeah, and he does it very explicitly. He's got a long passage in his memoir in which he describes White. He describes him as a passenger on the ship that he was taken from. He describes him as a slave. He describes him as a slave of a Delaware businessman. He says that he, in fact, liberated him and that he improved his condition. And what I'm able to show is that virtually every single thing that Semmes wrote about White was a lie. And we can show it with forensic documentation. For example, Semmes said that he was bettered and given the pay of his station and grade. Well, White had the position of cook on the Tonawanda, the ship he was taken from, and he was paid $15 a month. In the Alabama's registers and manifests, he has the position of boy with a salary of $9 a month. So his condition was bettered with a reduction in pay and a demotion, and so on.
Yeah, and this Semmes narrative, though, really did take hold. It got traction. I mean,
It got a lot of traction.
Yeah.
There must be at least a dozen books in the 20th century and in the first part of the 21st century on Semmes and the Alabama. And every single one of them simply recapitulates Semmes's description of White. No one had ever really gone to the primary record to see if what Semmes had to say about White was true. And, that was a little bit difficult for me because, I don't want to be the enfant terrible of history. I didn't see it was my role to, expose everybody that got the story wrong. But on the other hand, I had to document how White's story had been appropriated and found its way into conventional history. So I ended up putting a lot of those secondary references into the footnotes. That seemed like a good compromise for how to deal with it.
Yeah, you show your math, and it's interesting that this is part of an effort, I think, to rewrite Civil War history and to cast the Confederacy in a light that isn't completely arch and negative. And so this is a really great fable that they have concocted, that Semmes concocted, to sort of suggest, the warmer touch of the Confederate army, and they can, in this case, maritime army in this case.
Mm. Yeah, and another manifestation of that is that in his memoir, Semmes talks about the care that he took to save all those who couldn't swim. When actually what happened is that when the Alabama was finally vanquished by a Union vessel and started to sink, there was another vessel that came along that saved a very large proportion of the Confederate officers, and none of the individuals of White's rank, none of the boys or servants or stewards, they drowned. And in fact, the record shows that this vessel that saved the Confederate officers actually sank a lifeboat on its way as it escaped, leaving the Union vessel to pick up the remainder for a full half hour while the Confederates escaped.
Yeah, it's just remarkable. This is an incredible story of David Henry White, this young man, and who ends up on this Confederate vessel. And I want to talk about his experience there in a second. But I wondered if you can just give me a sense of, and give us a sense of the vessel and what it was doing. I mean, the Alabama raids had an impact on the Union merchant fleet. And I wonder if you can speak to sort of what was going on there.
Sure. Well, we're all familiar with the war on land and the horrific carnage of the battles of Shiloh and Teton, Gettysburg. We're less familiar with the international dimension of the war and the war on the high seas. And in some ways, the international dimension was as important as what was going on land, because the Civil War had become a war of attrition. Like the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, a lot depended upon which nations were going to recognize the Confederacy. So the Union had a policy and a strategy of a blockade, and was trying to interrupt commerce with the South. But the South responded by building these commerce raiders. And there were 4 or 5 of them. They went all over the North Atlantic, South Atlantic, and Indian Oceans, raiding Union commerce. And the Alabama was particularly effective. Over 3 years, if you can believe this, it destroyed or bonded, or took out of service, sank on the high seas 64 Union vessels and a warship.
That's extraordinary.
It destroyed Union commerce. About half of American vessels found foreign flags, and there was a 500% increase in maritime insurance. And it was said that the vibrant pre-war naval American merchant marine, never really recovered from the disaster. So that was one aspect of it. But another aspect of it is that every time he burnt a ship and every time he went into a friendly port in the British colonies and the French colonies, he was celebrated. And there was tremendous sympathy for the Confederacy, because economies of these countries really depended upon the cotton trade. And so when the Alabama finally sank, it was finally sunk in the Battle of Cherbourg on June 19th, 1864. It was a major international event, and it even contributed to Lincoln's reelection in the election of 1864.
Well, and it was David Henry White that was trapped on board, right? I mean, that was this is sadly, I mean, after this horrifying, you can give people an idea of what the conditions were like on the ship for David Henry White, abducted and now forced to work on board the ship under the conditions you'll describe, or just give us a rough idea, and then ultimately meets his demise because, isn't that right?
Yeah, well, we don't know exactly what his condition was. We know that Semmes and his officers said they took him because they needed servants in the officers' mess. Why did they need servants in the officers' mess? Well, for one thing, their whole lives they had been used to having their meals served by black servants, and there were none on the Alabama when it encountered the Tonawanda. Secondly, the Alabama encountered the Tonawanda. In its mailbags were the Philadelphia newspapers that carried the news of the draft Emancipation Proclamation. And that must have enraged Semmes, and I'm sure he wanted to make a point. But the other thing is that, and I talk about this in the book, that I look at the anatomy of the Alabama itself, of the ship, and it's very clear that the officers' quarters, it was quite traditional, the officers' quarters were in the rear, and that's where their mess was, where they ate. Where the crew was in the aft, in the front, in the forecastle, and the galley was also in the front. And there was no communication in the lower deck between these two areas. So if the officers wanted hot food, and they thought doing that sort of thing for themselves was a menial task they would never do, but the problem was the galley was at the other end of the ship, so they needed a menial, preferably a black one, to serve them. So his life involved going back and forth a couple of times a day from one end of the ship to the other, carrying food. And we don't know whether he was in irons when the ship went into port. The Confederates say, oh, every time we went into port, he was free as a bird. He could leave anytime he wants. Meanwhile, the actual accounts of the Alabama show that every time it went into port, sailors tried to desert, and they were always dragged back in irons and they were white, right? So
Yeah.
we can only imagine how they treated this fellow. And
Yeah.
it's
I
hard
mean,
to imagine
was
that he
there
was the one
any?
person on board who was allowed to leave the vessel.
Yeah, right. It would be that does sort of strain credulity. David Henry White, any records that would in any way suggest he tried to get away?
The closest thing I could find to that is that Semmes writes in his memoirs about another servant he had on a previous boat called the Sumter, a servant named Ned, whom he described as a loyal servant. But in fact, it turns out that Ned deserted in Suriname. So, you can't take anything that Semmes says at face value. Uh, we are told that White drowned in the final battle. I have no reason to believe otherwise. There's no evidence that he survived. He didn't show up on any of the records of the Cherbourg authorities or any of the records of either the Kearsarge, the boat that vanquished the Alabama, or on the British authorities. There's no evidence that he survived. I mean, you could always speculate that maybe there's a happy ending and he escaped, but it's that strains credulity too.
Sure.
You know.
Did the international maritime law world have any take on this?
The international maritime world had a huge take on the Alabama's voyage after the war. There was an international court of arbitration, which was very famous for being the first of its kind. And America was deeply upset with Great Britain because the Alabama had been constructed illegally in Liverpool in violation of neutrality rules. And so, the American government sued Great Britain, and eventually there was a settlement, an international arbitration, in which Great Britain had to pay America $15 million, which is a fortune in its day. White is actually mentioned in the deposition of the Tonawonda's captain. And so it is in the papers that White was kidnapped. However, there was no conversation or discussion of any kind of compensation to White's family that I could find.
Yeah, they were mostly concerned with the illegal construction of the vessel, as opposed to
they were concerned with the loss of the merchant cargoes.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. So, take me to today as we finish up here, because I felt as though this piece was so beautiful in the way that you have told the story of David Henry White, and it's encased in all of these other issues that are still quite so contemporary. I'm wondering what you want the reader to take away.
Well, for one thing, there's a resonance with the whole issue of disinformation. So, we're very concerned about disinformation now, most notably the 2020 election and all the lies that have been told about that. And of course, now in the world of AI, we have to be even more cautious about disinformation. But the point I want to make is that none of this is new. That this kind of disinformation goes back, it's really a very integral part of American history. And the disinformation about White really resonates with the kinds of lies we hear today. And it's been said, I'm not the first to notice this, but a number of historians have mentioned that the lost cause itself resonates with the stolen election narrative, in the sense that both of these are constructed narratives that are manufactured for the purpose of animating reactionary forces. And the kinds of rhetoric that we see in the language of Semmes is very familiar. Readers will, I let the readers read Semmes's own words, and I guarantee that you will find them to be extraordinarily familiar. I believe it's a good example of how we can use the present to understand the past.
Such a great point. And I think even with Civil War history, you're seeing an active, aggressive effort to recharacterize and reposition and retell things in a completely fictitious way. that serves another interest. It's scary. Andrew Sillen, author of Kidnapped at Sea, The Civil War Voyage of David Henry White. What a fascinating story with, as Andrew's saying, with instructive moments and overall instructive for today. By the way, kidnappedatsea.com is the website, but in addition to the website, there is, I'm told, a robust Facebook page for Kidnapped at Sea. How does that work? It's what is it called?
Kidnapped at Sea, the book.
Love it. Kidnapped at Sea, the book on Facebook. Get it there. Kidnappedatsea.com, and we'll have a click through to the book, Kidnapped at Sea, The Civil War Voyage of David Henry White. We'll have that for you underneath this video. So if you're watching this video or if you're listening on the podcast, just check YouTube, and there'll be a click through for the video, for the book under the video. Andrew, what a pleasure to meet you. I can only imagine the kind of work that went into this, because the records are so fragmented and scarce, and it took a real kind of writer, journalist, investigator to get it all done. So I really applaud you on that.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you.
Andrew Sillen, everybody. Good stuff. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.